Well, Tony Hiss, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thank you so much, Todd. Great to be with you.
Well, you've spent your career educating people on how to protect the environment and, the places that matter most. So what first inspired you to dedicate your life's work to conservation and restoration?
Well, I grew up in a city, but New York is a city with Central Park, which is an extraordinary landscape. It's on the Eastern Flyway, so every spring, the most amazing birds come and stop and have a bite to eat before heading north to raise the next generation. So I was exposed to it, and when I was a little kid, my family used to go up to the northeast of Vermont in the summertime, so got to see that wonderful mountain landscape too. So I guess it was baked into me at an early age. And then recently, well, about 10 years ago when I started writing this new book, Rescuing the Planet, I guess it was just the plight of the animals that was calling to me. The horrible realization that something like 1 million species are at risk of extinction in the next few decades, and what could be done about it. And I was lucky enough, I wasn't sure what could be done about it, to meet eowilson, the great Harvard biologist and conservationist and champion of biodiversity. And he was trying to think big, and he was saying, 10 years ago, we've got to get to think at a different scale if we're going to make a difference. And he and I were talking, and I threw out this phrase, half Earth, which he then picked up and ran with. But at the time, he was thinking, you throw out a goal like that just to get people's attention. He wasn't sure how realistic it sounded. In the business world, there's the phrase BHAG, a big, hairy, audacious goal. And then sometimes you throw that out just to galvanize people. And sometimes it actually has an impact quickly, like President Kennedy saying, let's put a man on the moon in this decade, and we did. But suddenly it's a subject that sort of has been catching up with itself. And it doesn't sound so outlandish and ridiculous and far-fetched. Now that we have an administration that has embraced the idea of protecting 30% of the US by the year 2030, 30 by 30, that's at least a stepping stone to what Wilson was talking about, which was 50 by 50, 50% of land and water protected by 2050. And it's not just the US now, it's 56 other nations have already signed on to this idea. And it looks like there's going to be a big meeting in China in October when 196 countries from around the world are going to endorse this global goal of 30 by 30. So actually things have dovetailed in a rather nice way, because my book is about the why of this and the how of it and how people can get started. And I guess the two questions I get asked most often are, why 50%? And then how can I get involved? And as to why 50%, well, a lot of reasons, but among them, studies by field biologists that creatures, plants, animals need at least half of their original habitat in order to continue to thrive. There's a range, some species as little as 25%, but some as much as 75% or more. So 50 sort of cuts the difference. And then Wilson himself was responsible for this wonderful advance in biological math, where you can now sort of predict the future by taking readings. And his work tends to show us that if we stay at 15% protected, back up a little, the country is about 15% protected at this point. And that is the culmination of 150 years of work, starting with Yellowstone National Park in 1870, the very first national park anywhere in the world. A great North American invention, something we can be very proud of. But then it's taken us 150 years to get from 0% protected to 15%. Now the challenge is to go from 15 first to 30, then to 50 in 10 years and 30 years, which means we'd have to work at a pace of something like 12 times the rate of what we've been doing previously. So it's a huge challenge. What I was happy to find out was how many people, as I toured all over North America, how many people are engaged in this, with how much energy they're bringing to it, how successful they're being. A wave that's not yet appreciated is flowing across the country and across the whole continent. Uh, and wonderful new strategies are being adopted, and people who are not even aware of what the next guy is doing are doing great things. So it turns out to be a hopeful book. Looks like a problem we can actually lick.
Definitely, definitely. What do you think though are some of the things that might hold back? This rescuing the planet takes place really in North America. The focus is on North America. So,
That's
what do you
true.
think are some of the things that could hold back, Canada, U.S., Mexico from reaching that goal of 50 by 50 in the next 29 years?
Well, we're sort of growing beyond a mindset that it's almost impossible to solve huge problems. And by thinking at a different scale, we're realizing that there is great hope. And Canada, in many ways, is leading the pack at this point, setting examples for us down here in the States, uh, for several reasons. One of the most amazing of which, and this is something that was eye-opening for me as a city kid from the States, is this extraordinary landscape that stretches across the north of Canada. The boreal forest actually goes into Alaska as well. Enormous and still intact. Something we thought had disappeared, at least we down here in the States had thought disappeared a century ago. The famous Frederick Jackson Turner saying that the frontier was gone. And now we had to live in a different era. And looking back at people like Joliet and Marquette as they canoed down the Mississippi River in 1673 and were astounded by the abundance of things. Or even Lewis and Clark in the early 19th century when Jefferson sent them out. And they wrote in their journals every day about coming up with astounding new numbers of creatures and feeling just overwhelmed by the amazingness and wonderfulness and abundance of the natural life. We thought this was all behind us. But the boreal forest is up there. It's 3,700 miles long. It's 1,000 miles from top to bottom. And it's at least 85% intact. You can just fly for hour after hour after hour and not see any signs of anything other than the boreal forest. And this is what makes it particularly special at this point, is that even though the Canadians have a dismal history with their indigenous population, they're called First Nations up there, they never displaced them the way we did. They never kicked them out. So they're still there. They've been in residence for 10,000 years. They know the landscape the way no one else does. Western science is only just beginning to catch up with the astounding knowledge and wisdom of what they've just lived all these years. And so there's this whole new wave of national parks coming into being in Canada, called Indigenous Protected Areas, or Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas. The idea being that this can happen rapidly because they're there. They can be the rangers from within, the mucklucks on the ground, as they like to say. And it's sort of a second tier. Well, it's on a par with the first tier, but a whole new network of national parks, even bigger than the traditional national parks, that can come into being quickly. So this gives Canada a chance to say, yes, we're going to fulfill our goal. It's so big, though, that when I got a chance to go up there, and it was so beyond what my mind was trying to assimilate that one night sitting around with a wonderful conservationist, we sort of came up with a whole new scale of measurement to think beyond. We think of Yellowstone as huge. Yellowstone is 2 million acres, roughly, a little more than that. Well, we thought, if that's the baseline, how do we think beyond that? I mean, humans are good at sort of inventing ways of thinking, of thinking easily about things that are impossible to think about. For instance, 93 million miles from the Earth to the sun. Well, that's cumbersome amount of time, but it's only one, the astronomers came up with the idea, one astronomical unit. So that shrinks things down. Well, if we're going to shrink landscapes down, one Yellowstone, one Y is sort of the basic unit, the penny. What's the next one up? A California, that's 200 million acres. A cal, so 50 cals, 50 Ys equals one cal. Well, there's the potential for several dozen cals worth of protected land in the boreal forest. Well, that's just astonishing, and something that we could do quickly, because it seems that in the current circumstances, there are sort of what I like to call the 3 R's. Retain what's still wild, like the boreal, restore what was wilder in areas that have gone through a lot of change, and then reconnect areas that got severed by different development. So those are the 3 R's. So that gives North America this great, and to me, until recently, unknown advantage in reaching a 30% goal. Just this week, a high-level, cabinet-level report came out from the new administration, signed by the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture and several others, proposing a 30 by 30 plan, which they called America the Beautiful, and making very, just stop for a second.
No problem.
Because of the telephone. This new plan being proposed, America the Beautiful, makes the basic point that this is all going to be done voluntarily. It's not a coercive procedure. It's not going to usurp anyone. It has to be done. Instead of the government coming in and taking over, what the government is going to, the federal government is going to do is come in and sprinkle some blessings on efforts that are already underway locally, generated by people who love places they live in. And that means, and they're already, that's part of what I was finding out, these efforts are already well underway all across the country. So this sounds practical, and it sounds like no one's going to be elbowed aside or told to do something they don't want to do.
Yeah, hopefully the United States, takes some lessons from its northern neighbor, as far as how they're giving the the indigenous people, the First Nation people, back their land to be able to protect it. To be honestly, protect it better than European, or the descendants of European colonialists have. So from your time speaking with indigenous leaders in the boreal forest, what do you think makes them better stewards of the land than those European descendants?
Well, for one thing, they're used to thinking at a much bigger scale. Some of the ones I was meeting up in the Northwest Territory, which is just below the Arctic Circle, their legends turn out to be very sophisticated ways of encapsulating the mind and information. So they've managed to bring together in one tale pieces of land that are hundreds of miles apart from each other, and also that reach way back. There were still giant beavers, to our eyes, something fabulous and unreal when they first got there. So they can tell stories that seem to be just simple stories about a wolverine or a beaver or a spirit, Um, but they're connecting together landscapes and time in a way that encapsulates a whole uh, era of time that's much bigger than anything we can think about. Also, the scientific approach to preserving, say, caribou is, but let's think 25 years ahead, what will the needs be? They say, oh no, we have to think at least 400 years ahead, or else it doesn't make sense. So they're just attuned in ways that we're slowly catching up with. Um, that story about the beaver and the wolverine was, they showed me a cliff that had a rock face that looked like a wolverine. Uh, and the story was that the wolverine had been uh, killing the giant beavers. And there is a mountain that has slashes on the side that look like the blood of a giant animal. But that mountain happens to be 100 miles south of where the wolverine is, the Wolverine Rock. And yet they are able to, in one story, have all of this huge territory uh, boiled down into this story as a way of thinking about the needs of the place.
Yeah, it just seems like a different mindset, you know, and you have this great quote in your book from Valerie Coutois, who is the director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative there in Canada, saying that in the planning that gets taught in schools, first you mark off areas for industrial development, then you decide what to protect. But in the planning that gets taught by the land, we start out asking what needs to stay where it is for Indigenous people to stay who they are. You know, what will you need to remain you? And from that quote, you know, it's clear that she feels that the land is an important part of her sense of identity, right? So she is fighting not only to protect the land, but really to protect her identity and the identity of her community. So, you know, how do you shift, or how can you shift the mindset of, you know, of people, you know, that makes them also kind of tie their own sense of identity to the land in a way that makes them want to fight for it and conserve it the way indigenous people have for millennia?
Well, that is the key question, Ty. Um, and again, I think there are several answers. Uh, one of them is that it's actually not unknown among us down here to try and think at bigger scales and to feel connected in different ways. And one of the first people who did it was Benton Mackay, the great forester who invented the Appalachian Trail. And it happened to him because when he graduated college, this was in 1900, um, he celebrated by hiking and bushwhacking his way up Stratton Mountain in Vermont, in the Green Mountains, part of the Appalachians. Shinnied up a tree at the top of the mountain and swaying from its branches, suddenly got this sense that there was this single landscape unfolding before him all along the entire stretch of the Appalachian Mountains, from Maine to Georgia, uh, what he later called a planetary feeling, and that this was one single place. Well, it was not until 20 years later that he actually unfolded his idea of a footpath winding its way across, along the ridgetops, an idea which caught people's imagination so instantly that within 12 years, that path had come into being, almost entirely built by volunteers. Um, very much something just people decided we have to do this, and they did it. 2,190 miles long. And Mackay was always interested not just in the ridgetops, but in the whole landscape on either side, what he called the realm. Uh, and now they're sort of beginning to think, okay, we've got the trail, we've got to protect the realm as well. So people, I think, some people were always open to thinking at a different scale. I think now there is more that it's sort of seeping into people. Very few people, as we know, have been able to get on rockets and get out into space. But almost universally, they report looking back that the world looks so different to them, that they see this gorgeous planet and its astonishing nature, but also how vulnerable and alone it looks. And this even has a name, the overview effect. And I think we're beginning to assimilate that sense down here, those of us who never get into rockets, what I call the interview effect. And one person who got that started was another extraordinary mind, a Russian biologist named Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky, who in the 1920s wrote the first sort of definitive book about the biosphere, Biosfera. And he's now revered in Russia, although still largely unknown on this side of the world. There's a Moscow subway station named for him, and there's a crater on the dark side of the moon named for him. Well, he sort of gave a definition and a shape to this strange landscape we all inhabit, all species. It pointed out that it was ancient. We now think, life goes back at least 3.8 billion years or more. Immense when you look around the world from side to side, but it had this third dimension too. Its height, or rather its lack of height, its thinness. Almost all of life seems to be contained within this layer from the bottom of the ocean up to the top of Mount Everest. Well, that's a distance of only 12.5 miles. And if you laid it out horizontally, it's a distance you could drive across in 20 minutes on a decent road, meaning you could drive from one end of life to the other in 20 minutes. So here we have this situation that we're inhabiting, which has, on the one hand, this astonishing immensity and age, but on the other hand, this built-in precariousness. It's mighty thin. So I think we're beginning to sense that, and it's getting over a mindset that has sustained us for perhaps too long. Back in the Depression, my parents were flourishing way back then in the 1930s. There was a lot of scrimping and saving and making do, and that was an old American tradition of making do. And during World War II, in order to further the war effort, people were sacrificing themselves, and there were victory gardens, little vegetable gardens on every scrap of vacant land in cities. After World War II, President Truman convened a commission to examine natural resources. And they came back with what was then considered the wonderful news that don't have to worry about it, guys. The sky's the limit, or rather the ground's the limit. We'll never run out of things we need in order to make other things. Well, we are running out, and that's catching up with us. So and we realize that we waste the landscape in ways to get things we need. And it's not that we don't need them, but this big article I haven't quite finished yet on the front page of today's New York Times about how green cars need lithium for their batteries. And so there's a proposal to blow up a mountain in northern Nevada to scrounge out some lithium. So we need to think even more carefully even about the green things. It ain't so green, as someone was saying, to blow up a mountain just in order to have electric cars. We need to reinvent mining so that it's a surgical strike and not just pattern bombing of the landscape. Um, so much is going on all at once uh, that I think that, as I said, the question I get is, how do I get involved? Well, the good news is that this is a house with hundreds of doors. Uh, Almost everywhere you look or think, you can get involved if it feels like something you'd like to do. Um, Whether your interest is in bird watching, because the bird people are organized, whether your interest is in hiking, because the trails people are organized, whether you're interested in land protection, because they're organized, and also they're all coming together in ways that is quite new. Um, Land protection people are teaming up with bird people. Uh, for instance, in the New England forest, I got a chance just recently to go see, and it's in the book, a forest in Western Massachusetts, where um, wood thrush is one of the species, forest species, an astonishing bird because it has sort of two sets of vocal cords and it can sing two songs simultaneously, this haunting melody that you hear sort of drifting through the woods. Well, they're in trouble, the wood thrush are in trouble, but so the bird people are taking active censuses. And so now you can meld how you manage the land with how the birds are responding. And they're making the wood thrush the canary in the coal mine, or the sentinel bird of the health of these forests. Uh, the trails and the land people are also teaming up in ways that they never did together. So that's yet another piece of good news, is people finding ways to come together, to collaborate.
Yeah, and you talk a lot about the science of conservation biology in rescuing the planet. So how has that field evolved and provided us with the knowledge and the tools needed to start making real progress toward conservation?
Well, the science has been gelling over the last few generations. And the idea of reconnecting landscapes as a way of getting something bigger than the sum of its parts. Um, One of the people who pioneered that is a wonderful biologist named Reed Noss, who pioneered this effort when he was working in Ohio along the Ohio River Valley at the southern end of that state, and realized that there was far more land still there than people had thought, but it needed, it was in chunks, and there were still these passageways between them that if you protect along with the chunks, you would have a network of places that would support an extraordinary array of critters. And he made a report for his bosses he was working for, I think the state natural resources group at that point. But this was back in the 70s, and they were horrified. They said, "Oh no, really, you're asking far too much of us. We'll get laughed out of court. Please, Reed, cool it." Well, instead of cooling it, he went down to Florida, where he worked his same thinking and came up with a plan for protecting, oh, 30 to 50% of or more of Florida. Again, with the same idea that there are chunks like the Everglades at the bottom of Florida, and other chunks up at the top, like Okefenokee Swamp on the Georgia-Florida border. Big intact areas, but isolated, but you could snake them, connections between them. Well, an interesting idea, but it so happened that when he was announcing this with his partner, um, a candidate for governor stopped by, and suddenly it became news. And now that's sort of the official plan for Florida, and they have protected close to 30% already. So the science became something that made sense to uh, political leaders and administrators, but also to local groups, because they could be the ones saying, well, we're going to take this particular part of that corridor and make it our goal to protect that. And yes, we're doing it for ourselves, but we can see now that we're doing it for the whole state and all the creatures in the whole state.
Well, I really enjoyed the story of Pluie. So I'd love
Oh,
if you don't mind, if you wouldn't just tell the audience, who was Pluie and why was she so important to our understanding of animal migratory patterns?
I'm glad you brought up Fluey, but I'll take one step back. If Benton Mackay was sort of the visionary in the east of the U.S., uh, a more recent visionary in the West is a Canadian activist named Harvey Locke, who had the same kind of experience in the Northern Rockies, that it too was a single landscape. This was back in the early 90s. And he came up with the idea of that Yellowstone north up to the top of the Yukon, Yellowstone to Yukon was a single place in that sense, and set up a conservation group and coalition, Y2Y, Yellowstone to Yukon, which it now has protected about 20% of that landscape. However, Harvey had a co-founder, and the co-founder was Pluie, and Pluie was a wolf. Pluie was caught in a drenching rainstorm uh, near Banff National Park in the early 90s, just at the moment when they could put collars on critters that could be read by satellites. It's a huge new advance. Um, the thinking was, well, we know wolves wander around a bit, so Pluie will probably show us that she's traveled 50 to 60 miles. And that will be very useful information. But what happened was, first Pluie seemed to disappear. They just weren't getting any readings off of this collar anymore. And they thought, oh, well, that's science, back to the drawing boards. But several months later, they got a call from some NASA people in Idaho saying, we just picked up your wolf on our tracking machinery. She's all the way down here. Well, it turned out they had lost her simply because they weren't thinking far enough afield. And over the next 18 months, Pluie traversed an area 10 times the size of Yellowstone National Park.
Incredible.
10 Ys right there, through 3 US states and 2 Canadian provinces. So suddenly we have the ability to bring the animals in as part of our research. They're our co-researchers because they can tell us exactly where they are. And now we know that predators like wolves wander, many of them over enormous distances, but that at the same time, we're getting a better reading on their prey, the grass eaters, the ungulate mammals. And there's just a new article this week in Science magazine about international atlas of ungulate migrations, caribou, mule deer, all of these animals. And that too has been an eye-opening discovery. In the case of mule deer, some Wyoming mule deer were collared just a few years ago. And it was thought, oh, well, they would wander around a little bit. Well, it turned out they were part of a 150-mile-long migration that had been going on for thousands of years that no one had ever noticed. And suddenly we were confronted with that reality. The culmination of the Pluie research and the mule deer research is that there's now antenna on the International Space Station capable of picking up signals from up to 300,000 animals simultaneously. And the kind of banding and collaring we can do has been going through extraordinary generations of miniaturization. So now we can put little bands on very tiny things, even smaller than birds, some large insects. So we can begin to really consult the animal kingdom about where it's going and what its needs are. And that is the work of a brilliant German-American, German scientist, Martin Witkowski, supplemented by an American helper who came up with the idea and modestly never thought much of it until he got into conversations with Martin when Martin was doing graduate work in the US.
Well, better understanding these migratory patterns allows conservationists or people that are, that are protecting the land to set up movement zones. So can you talk about movement zones and how they protect migratory animals like Pluie?
Well, the mule deer migration is a good case in point because you can be more precise about the movements of these hoofed mammals, the grass eaters. It turns out that they are attracted north by the greening that comes in spring. The green wave, it's called surfing the green wave. And that's why they would move from southern Wyoming all the way up into the Tetons and beyond. So they follow a path, but it's one that they've devised. And each generation has to teach the next generation. But this is how it's done. So that's a relatively narrow pathway. There are stopover points, but then you can define pretty precisely what land they are using and need to use in order to get from A to B, and then back to A again in the fall. And that, of course, turns out to be a patchwork of federal land, state land, county land, and private land. And the challenge is to then get people interested in the idea of let them through in a way that won't disturb what you're up to. They need certain kinds of fencing that they can get through. Some stop them, others let them through. So it is a matter of sort of retrofitting that corridor to make sure it's mule deer safe. And that's a similar kind of thing. But that kind of reconnection works at various scales too. Back up in Banff National Park, and the Canadians have the second oldest national park. All credit to them. It's the only national park that has an interstate or the equivalent of an interstate highway running through it. A big coast-to-coast Canadian highway. And that severs landscapes too. Highways, we're just beginning to realize highways sever landscapes, but up there, they now have this 20-year history of reconnecting the land that's been severed by the highway by building an extraordinary collection of 43 bridges over the highway and tunnels under the highway, which are exclusively for the use of animals. No humans allowed. And they track the movements of the animals with cameras, hidden cameras, critter cams. And they've been able to show that several 100,000 wolves and caribou and wolverines and moose and what have you have, and much smaller animals too, have made use of these passageways. And so these landscapes are now healed. In New England, I'm not changing the subject, in New England, in the early 19th century, that landscape had been largely forested when Europeans got here. And then in the early 19th century, there was this sheep craze, this boom, partly as a result of the Napoleonic Wars, which upset things over in Europe. And crafty Americans could take some wonderful merino sheep with their wool and bring them over here and start raising them. Well, the sheep craze, instead of 90% of the landscape being forested, now 20% of the landscape was forested. The famous stone walls of New England are actually sheep pens. That's where the sheep were being held. Um, it went smash in just 20 years, and the farmers moved west um, and left behind this denuded landscape. The forests returned, um, and now so successfully that there's a movement called Wildlands and Woodlands in New England to say we can keep at least 70% of this landscape permanently in woodland if we increase our conservation work. But the point I'm slowly getting to is that the interstate highways are these same kinds of sheep pens. They are landscape and animal dividers in ways that engineers had no idea when they were innocently building these highways in the 1950s and 1960s. So that's a huge retrofit problem, but also, as the Canadians, again, bless them, the Canadians have shown, uh, is doable. Uh, Banff is a single landscape again, and we can make the same happen down here.
And what a great opportunity to build back better, right? You use England's areas of outstanding natural beauty as an example that North America could follow to better protect a greater portion of the land and the species. So what are these AONBs?
AONBs, areas of natural beauty, is a term that even the English admit is rather clunky. English never had a national park system until after World War II, when they decided that part of creating a land fit for the heroes who had won the war was to have parks and protected landscapes. And they glommed onto another American idea, one that we had sort of abandoned, the idea that you can have places that you decide are special for all kinds of reasons. But you don't have to own them. The government doesn't have to own all of them in order for them to be special. We pioneered this in the Adirondack Park up in northern New York State. It's 6 million acres, but it's only about half in public ownership. The rest is private ownership. But there's a general agreement that it needs to change only in ways that will protect that specialness. It's called a Green Line Park. So the English, who have a long history, of course, of private land use, set up a national park system of Green Line parks. And then, as an adjunct to it, they set up a separate system of these areas of natural beauty, which were tended to be slightly flatter and less spectacular. The national parks encompass areas like the Lake District up in the north of England, which was so beloved by William Wordsworth. And he sort of planted the idea by saying that even though this is private land, in some ways, it's so special, it belongs to everyone who has an eye to see and a heart to feel with. It's part of the legacy of our country. Well, these two adjacent systems of the parks and the areas of outstanding natural beauty cover something like 30% of England and Wales. Pretty good thinking. Suddenly, well, again, in the 1970s, people began to think maybe it was time to recapture the Green Line Park idea for the US. And some smart people in the National Park Service got together and began to draw up a list of potential Green Line parks. And it turned out they created this sort of down and dirty map, which somehow I got a copy of a couple of hundred places all over the country, which were unprotected, but considered special by the people who were treasured by the people who lived there. I thought of it as the treasure map. This was going to be the great environmental introduction and legacy and accomplishment of the second Jimmy Carter administration. Well, there never was a second Jimmy Carter administration because Ronald Reagan beat him in 1980, and the idea sort of went back on the shelf. until now, when it's suddenly being revived. And a group on the East Coast, the Delmarva Peninsula, is this land on the east side of the Chesapeake Bay, between the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean. It's this long peninsula, pretty flat, and politically divided as much as you could divide any small place. It's 3 different states have a part of it. It's most of Delaware. It's partly Maryland, it's partly Virginia. So that's why it has the awkward name Delmarva Peninsula. Del for Delaware, Mar for Maryland, Va for Virginia. But they've all come together to decide they want to create a Green Line Park. Their goal is to protect 50% of that landscape by 2030. Talking to them, we agreed that areas of outstanding natural beauty was an awkward term at best. So we could shorten it to outstanding areas, go down to OAs, and then, that could be expanded into oasis. So their project is called the Delmarva Oasis. And if they can pull it off, that too would be a model for the rest of the country. And here we already have a map of what these wonderful landscapes are. And a great landscape architect digitized the map for me. So now it's ready to roll. Again, I think the urgency of this situation is sparking interest in so many different kinds of strategies, old ones, new ones, ones you might never think of.
Yeah, well, President Biden has shown, in his first 100 days in office, that he wants to build a more sustainable infrastructure and a cleaner, more just economy for America. So, how do we use this moment of the nation really focusing on sustainability to implement better land and species conservation strategies?
Well, I think that's already well underway. That's the good news. And in effect, the feds are Johnny-come-latelys to this because so much is happening all across the continent at so many different scales. And the wonderful thing about working on this book was a chance to get to meet people all over the continent who are making an impact and having successful programs and projects. So, as I said, one thing people can do if they get interested is just look around for ways to hook into what's already happening. Just Google, whatever your interest is, whether it's hiking or bird watching or protecting land. There's a wonderful environmental planner up in Maine named Ulla Amundsen, who says when people ask him that question, he tells them, well, who's the Henry David Thoreau of your area? Who's thought about the wonderfulness of that, of where you are? Who is the Andrew Wyeth? Who's painted the specialness of that landscape? In Wyeth's case, it was the Brandywine Valley in Pennsylvania. There's a richness of thinking and doing that it's really quite easy to tap into. That's why I said this is a house with hundreds of doors for anyone who wants to get involved.
What a great way to end the conversation. Again, the book is Rescuing the Planet, Protecting Half the Land to Heal the Earth. Tony, this was such an enjoyable and inspiring read. So I highly recommend this book to our audience, and we'll link to the book in our show notes. Is there anywhere else online that our listeners can follow your work?
Well, I've been doing a number of sort of virtual book launch events, some of which are posted online. But there's no, I have a Twitter page, but there's no one spot at this point. But you're inspiring me to think that there should be.
Well, we'll definitely link to those book tours in your Twitter handle as well. Tony Hiss, thank you again for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you, Ty. You made it such a fun conversation.